much for taking the time today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited actually to be able to chat with your audience. I always enjoy doing that and have an opportunity to share a little bit about
Yes,
what we know. So,
I can't wait to share your knowledge with all of the listeners and kind of do a deep dive. This is one topic that I know I've had a lot of my personal patients ask about.
yeah.
So, yeah, having someone very confident in the science and the research, I'm very grateful for this. If you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners and, a little bit about your background and knowledge base on EMFs.
Heather, thanks so much for inviting me. I really do appreciate it. It's sort of interesting how I got into the electromagnetic radiation space. I was actually in Bell Labs years ago, and I was responsible for writing standards and testing technology to make sure it complied with the network. So I had a lot of technical background in the telecommunication space, where we often talk about electromagnetic radiation in that space. About, probably 17, 18 years ago, my wife's watches was watching my sons, who are adult men, have laptops on their lap. And she said, that can't be good for you. Now, she's a social worker at the time, right? And so not an engineer. And I said, of course it doesn't help. No, there's no problems whatsoever with the exposures of the Wi-Fi signal on the male, or for that matter, the female. And but what's interesting, I never really thought about it. And so I and my sons looked into it a little bit. And did you know, Heather, 15, 16 years ago, we already knew 25% of the male sperm is immobile as a result of 3 to 4 hours of exposure. Now, I was in science space. I was in the standard space, and I didn't know that. And that sort of bothered me that, at that time, no one knew about this space as even something that it was influencing. It was helping our social infrastructure. We could talk to each other, we can contact each other, but was it doing any danger to the human body from the exposures? So that's actually how we started. My wife saying, I don't want that laptop in your lap because it could be dangerous.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love, having your background and doing that deep dive into the science with it. The fact that a lot of the research has been out, well, you knew 15, 20 years ago, I feel like so much of the population still doesn't know
Yeah,
its
yeah.
impact. So yeah, it's amazing to me how little education there is out there.
Yeah, well, I often compare it to smoking. When I'm a fairly older guy, and I was smoking cigarettes, trying smoking cigarettes when I was 12 years old, and that was 60 years ago, 55, 60 years ago. And do you know, at that time, science knew that there was a direct correlation between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer. Science knew it at that time, but no one else did. It was not common knowledge in any way. And it took 20, 30 more years for it even to be known as publicly that you can die from smoking cigarettes. Well, I think that's the case here, because actually, as I continued the research, Heather, I found there was a preponderance of evidence that was around for years and years about this subject, but it was obscure. The researchers knew it, but they didn't talk to the physicians. The
Mhm.
physicians didn't know much about it. And when someone came into their office and said, I have a headache, they said, well, take 2 aspirin. They had no idea it was the Wi-Fi 5 foot away from them that was causing the headache, which is known as electromagnetic radiation hypersensitivity. So there's actually words for these things that we actually, very few of us actually know about.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't think, as you said, the physicians haven't, most of them haven't been educated. It's not
No,
installed in the curriculum. And
right,
then there's that gap between physician, researcher, and of course, patient.
right. And actually, I found those silos very much siloed,
Hmm.
and information wasn't going back and forth between the silos, and that's really why we didn't know. Interesting fact, when we were doing it, there was already reasonable amount of evidence that you were sensitive to the radio frequency signals that were coming from the cell phones, from the Wi-Fi, from the laptop, from now the iPads and everything else we have in electronics. And it was roughly 15 to 20% of us that were feeling it in some way. Our ears were ringing, maybe our eyes were hurting a little bit. There was tingling going on. We had allergic flu kinds of reactions, and roughly 15 to 20% at that time of our population was electric hypersensitive. And today, it's about 40 to 50%. We just don't know it. And so the more this technology became around us,
Right.
the more the body was responding to the invasion. It's a toxin, and it does impact the human body.
Absolutely. So, backtracking just a little bit, because I know this is a little bit of a foreign concept for my listeners. What exactly is EMF radiation and where does it come from?
Okay, that's a wonderful question because light is electromagnetic radiation, and people don't quite realize it. But and you probably know blue light
Mhm.
is dangerous to the retina, the macula of the eye. So let's talk about that. When you have wiring in your house and electricity is running through that wire and it's lighting a light bulb, you have electromagnetic radiation. It's called extremely low frequency. So when you're really, really close to a wall, some of us actually can feel that electricity running through the wall. So that's extremely low frequency. Then you have your Wi-Fi, your laptop, tablets, your cell phone. Your cell phone itself generates like 3 or 4 different RF signals, radio frequency signals that are emitting from the cell phone every time you're using it. It's the Wi-Fi connects to, it's the self connection that it has. It has ground location information about it. So there's all these sources right from your cell phone itself that potentially has an impact into your environment. And then as you go up, that's called non-ionizing radiation, that space. Then you get into the light space. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, within that light space, on the higher end of the spectrum, you have blue light. And blue light is known. You go to the for eyeglasses today, and they say, "Guy, you need blue light glasses." Well, why? Why do I need that? Because the macula is prematurely deteriorating as a result of those exposures from all the screens you're looking at all day.
Mhm.
And so you have that light part, and then above that you have the what they call ionized radiation, and that's X-rays and it's gamma rays, and it's the high end of the spectrum. And everyone often thinks, oh, X-rays, I'm going to get really hurt really bad if I'm too much exposed to the X-ray. Well, it turns out the electron of the cell is actually knocked out of the orbit, and it's ionized or it's charged, and that's why they call it ionized radiation. And that's why it's dangerous, because it mutates the cell and you damage the DNA of the cell. What's interesting is what we're talking about today is the non-ionized, which does not knock the electron out of its orbit, but rather breaks the cell itself down
Mm.
with exposures. And most of the time, most of us are pretty okay, but for some of us, it can get pretty serious. It may be going beyond the I'm anxious because I have exposures. My body aches because I have exposures. But it can be DNA damaged cells, mutated cells that over time become potentially cancerous.
Exactly.
It's been known for years and years and years that when you're within 1,000 foot of a high power line, the 10,000 volt, the really heavy duty ones, that you can take a light bulb and put it in front of it and it lights up. It's been known for leukemia, but it's also true there are other illnesses and as well as cancers associated with. But most of the time, when you talk about cancers with the human body, you talk more about the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is soft tissue,
Uh-huh.
and you put your cell phone right next to the frontal lobe.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to depart right now and tell you a bit about the background of that standard that is supposedly protecting you. over 30 years ago, the FCC looked at a huge database of 6 foot men. And they said, what is the signal level that we should have limit before it heats up more than 2 degrees? They were worried about the thermal impact of an RF signal from a cell phone into the head. And so they came up with, the numbers are not terribly important, 1.6 watts per kilogram. The power level is 1.6 watts, and it can go into a male head 1 to 2 inches and won't heat up more than 2 degrees. Well, why do I say 2 degrees? It's a microwave signal.
Uh,
It's a microwave. 1.9 gigahertz is the signal level for microwave. And when you put a piece of meat into an oven, it's at 1,000 watts and it's cooking the meat. It's oscillating the cells through heating up the water. And all of a sudden, voila, you have cooked meat. Well, guess what? That's what's going on in your head as well when you're using it. And I'm a 6 foot male,
uh-huh.
thick-headed 6 foot male, right? It turns out that it roughly represents about 2 to 3% of the population that uses cell phones. Over the 30 years, we now give our 6-year-old child a cell phone.
Right.
And that 1 to 2 inches was for a 6 foot male. For a 6-year-old, it's all the way through the head. And by the way, the preponderance of evidence is not the thermal impact. We know the thermal impact can impact the cell, but we're talking about the biological impacts. With most of the study work today in science, it's the biological impacts that are being measured, not the heat temperature having the difference. And that's sort of the importance of the standard. It was written many, many years ago for a population that's thick-headed anyway.
Yeah.
And it's really majority women. The cranial nerve, the crane is not thick as thick.
Hmm.
The resistant path is less. And if you're young enough, it goes right through the head.
Yeah.
And what's the impact of that over time? We really don't know because we really don't have many, many years of experience with this yet.
And I would assume that's probably something ethically that we don't study with cell phones and kids, or have there been studies out there?
Oh, that's a wonderful question because it gives me a chance to talk about it a little bit. When you look for studies, scientific studies, they're structured, they're population sizes, and they look for changes in environments, and they measure those environments. And so almost all the studies today are not statistically significant. In
Mm,
other words, they don't have 10,000 kids
right.
locked in one room and radiating those 10,000 kids and then not radiating the other 10,000 and look at the statistical differences in the results of those exposures. And so there is no significant scientific evidence that shows that children are more susceptible than adults. On the other hand, there are many, many studies that show there are differences in populations. We know with children, for example, a lot of the studies talk about the not the headache, but the anxiety, the depression, and think of it today when your children go to school, they're all using routers, Wi-Fi, and repeaters in your room 7, 8 hours a day, and it's exposing those children, including the exposures from all the transmitters and the laptops they're using and all the tablets they're using. So they're really getting hit with a lot. And some science shows that the depression and anxiety is directly associated with those kinds of exposures.
Interesting. I could see that. And, statistically showing there's been a rise with teenagers with suicidal ideations,
Yeah,
depression, anxiety.
yeah, exactly. So this could be one reason those statistics are shifting. I certainly think that's likely true based on all the evidence that I've seen, but it's not statistically significant, so you can't make that claim.
Right.
Now, it turns out the National Toxicity Program, which is part of the federal government, did a study, epidemiology study, and they found elevated frontal lobe lesions in cancer and heart. And
Mm,
so they were statistically significant with mice and rats, but very large populations. It also is true that that was reinforced with the Ramazzani Institute, which is out of Italy, that did a similar kind of study where they exposed the rats and mice, and they found similar rise in statistical significance in frontal lobe cancer and heart cancers. So the evidence is pretty strong
right.
that we know that there is an impact, and some of us have more experience and exposure, like I do, like because I look for this information, and others have none. And that's sort of why I appreciate you chatting with your base, because maybe we can help them understand and make choices in their own life.
Yeah, I feel like again, this like in the holistic world, we talk about supplements, we talk about exercise, red light, sauna, diet, all of that, but no one is really significantly talking about EMF protection
Right.
consistently.
It,
So,
it really, actually, there really are some who are doing it.
mhm.
For example, Kennedy, believe it or not,
Yes.
Kennedy went to the court and won that said the standards, the FCC standards, weren't compliant with law because they didn't look at evidence when they recently reaffirmed the standards. So there is, but how many people know that Kennedy won a court against the FCC? And Deborah Davis is a doctor that's been doing work for years and years and years, and she's been documenting her understanding of this subject matter for years with the Environmental Health Trust. And then, of course, we have people like the Bio Initiative, which is a series of scientists who collect information about this kind of stuff and try to make it available to the public. So we're getting there.
Yeah,
It's slow.
it's slow. Yeah, education is key.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So how can like focusing on the little ones and even adolescents, being on their iPads, their Chromebooks, I see so
Right.
many AirPods, all of that, which, of course we don't do in our house. How can we start with protection? What can we do about it?
I'll answer that question in a second.
Okay.
I want to talk about the iPad.
Uh,
Okay. So I mentioned that the standard for a cell phone is 1.6 watts per kilogram.
yeah.
That's just a power level. Well, Bluetooth is 15 times less that power level. So it's about 1 watts roughly. And there is science that shows that 1 watt can mutate and cause cancer in the frontal lobe. So for me, I've seen some evidence that talks about the dangers potentially of long-term use. And so when you have particularly earpieces that talk to each other,
Uh-huh.
it's Bluetooth they're using. And it's going back and forth in the brain. It's like, so for me, that's introducing potential dangerous environments for the kids. And I don't recommend it at all. So let's go back to your question. What can you do? Don't use earpieces, right? That's the one thing you shouldn't do. But it's really actually fairly simple. It's like distance is your friend. So with your laptop or tablet, when you're not using it, just put it 4 foot or so away from you. And it really does mitigate the risk almost to zero. So simple distance from a transmitted signals really does make an important difference. If you and I were talking on the phone and we talked for 3 minutes and we hung up, that is unlikely statistically to be a problem for your frontal lobe. If you're talking, it's used for 2 or 3 hours with each other. After 10 years, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to get frontal lobe cancer.
Ugh.
And so it's really, there's some science we know about already that shows that when you have protracted use and exposures, the human body over time rebels to some extent. and it can get serious. You know, we were talking about the power to your house, the high power and causing cancers. Let's talk about cell phones. There was recent research out of Germany, and they looked at populations that were close to the towers,
Hmm.
and they tracked those individuals and their proximity to the tower within a thousand meters or whatever around the transmitter. They found chromosomal damage as you got closer to the tower. So is that science that says everyone is going to have that problem? No, the population wasn't large enough. But it did point out that there is data
Hmm.
that we're beginning to understand that showed evidence where there was really chromosomal damage. That to me was pretty dangerous observation that people really need to know when you're close to these transmitted rates. If you are pregnant, first trimester, and you have exposures through that first trimester, you're 3 times more likely to get a miscarriage.
Wow.
In one study that was done in San Francisco a few years ago. The thing is, I can go on and on and on about the evidence, but what you're pointing to is what can you do?
Hmm.
What do I control that it maybe can help that environment? And I often say it's you own your environment, no one else does. And if you make the changes, don't expect others to do that for you, right? And so distance is your friend. Time you use it is your friend. If it's very short, you're quite safe. Long, you're endangered. And the other is shielding. You can actually shield. There are many products on the market that actually show where you can transmit on one side of the shield and protect the human body on the other side. And so there's things you can do. But most of the time is be careful where it's coming from and simply avoid it. I'll give you an example. I talk about transmitters as bees in the room. The more bees you have in the room, the more dangerous it is. One won't kill you, 1,000 will.
Right.
So your goal in your family room is turn off all the transmitters in the room, move them away. And do you really need 3 or 4 transmitters coming out of your cell phone? No, I only call people. I don't need to have my Wi-Fi connected as well. So I just turn them off. I don't have a router in the room. But why? Because it, combined, it's too much RF in the room. And so by removing them, turning them off, taking them out of the room, you're reducing the number of bees in the room. So you think about it a little bit and say, what can I do in my room that helps my environment? And so there are things you can do.
That makes complete sense. Yeah. Now, I've seen and I've had a couple of patients ask me about the shielding clothing. Is there research behind that?
So a lot of things on the market in that space is pretty legitimate.
Okay.
You're in the middle of a field and you stand up and you're the highest point. What happens? Electricity, lightning comes and you get hit.
Hmm.
Well, that's what happens with electromagnetic radiation. It gets attracted to the shirt that you're wearing, and it dissipates the energy into the fabric itself. So it really does help.
Okay.
And so that is other ways people can actually take an action to reduce exposures because it really somewhat works with most of the stuff on the market.
Does it matter? And this is just a thought I had since you mentioned the reflections. Does it matter if the fabrics, say it's not marketed for EMF shielding, is there a difference between like natural fabrics like cotton and linen versus polyester and the synthetics?
So the fact is they are substantially different.
Okay.
When you talk about a piece of clothing that is shielding your body, there is silver threads that are woven into the material that actually is the conduit
Uh,
for that power. Cotton does not have that conductive path. naturally in it. So they are different, and they actually do work for that reason. It's taking that energy and moving it away.
Got it. Got it. The other thing you mentioned about cell phones and distance is your friend. I had read somewhere, and I don't know if it's true, so I'll pick your brain on putting your phone on plane mode.
Yeah, actually, that works.
Okay.
Very simple reason why. The transmitter is off. It's not going out. And that's where the potential dangers are, when the transmitter is out.
Got it.
So it does work.
Got it. And so the other thing too, to kind of elaborate on the difference between 5G versus 4G, why is 5G more of an issue? And then is it the same protection that we do with the other EMFs?
So 5G is very different than all previous technologies. When we were talking about the spectrum before, and we were talking about RF, radio frequency, that's roughly around 1 to 2 gigahertz. So
Okay.
what is a gigahertz? 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. A wave goes by in 1 second. That's a hertz, 1 cycle per second. In your wall, it's 60 cycles per second. That's the frequency, 60 cycles. That's why they call it extremely low frequency, 60 cycles per second. When you go to an RF signal from a cell phone, it's roughly around 1 gigahertz. That's 1 billion cycles per second.
Okay.
And so you have all these speeds going much faster. Your Wi-Fi is 2.4 gigahertz and can go up to roughly 6 gigahertz. But that's roughly been the range of frequencies that been introduced in our environment from telecommunications, including communications with television signals, radio, ham radio signal. All those communications are all typically below the 6 gigahertz. With 5G, it can typically go as high as 20 to 90 gigahertz.
Wow.
So it's 20 billion cycles per second, 90 billion cycles per second. So it's really, 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 really fast. And because it's so fast, it doesn't go very far. So they have to find ways of sending more of that signal to you. So they call it beaming, where they have two transmitters transmitting to one source. And so the technologies they're using, not only is it faster, but there's more power that's being used to get it there. So when you have a 5G cell tower, a small cell site in front of your house,
Mm-hmm.
it's typically at 20 gigahertz. That'll only go 750 feet, but it starts at 20 watts. A cell phone is 1.6 watts, right? This is 20 watts. So your kids are in the front yard in front of this cell tower. They haven't ever seen that kind of power level to that child in that front or in the front lawn than any other previous technologies. And that's where the heart of the argument is.
Right.
Uh, it's improving communications. There's no doubt about that. But it's introducing technologies we just don't have experience at. But I'll tell you a story. Complain in college and run around and complain on the campus. They would hose us down with water. Uh, Today, they have a 60 gigahertz high powered signal they use, and they transmit it. And you have in your skin um, sweat glands
Uh-huh.
that act like little antennas for 60 gigahertz. And you heat up and you run. So you used to get cold water. Now you run because it's too hot, because the body is reacting differently to that frequency rate.
Got
And that's in the heart. That's sort of the controversy. We really just don't know.
right.
Another study I saw that um, your gut loves RF. It turns out when you are electric hypersensitive, almost all people who are electric hypersensitive, they have a DEV-C bug in their stomach, that actually can get pretty seriously dangerous to you. So it's if you're really very hypersensitive, you really got to be careful because there are biological changes going on in your stomach that could be dangerous to you.
No
Um,
kidding.
yeah, the gut really is impacted. It likes RF.
Does
And
it,
it turns out that 20 gigahertz, I saw a study that
huh?
showed the same thing.
So does it feed the bad bacteria? Well, how does,
Yeah, yeah, it propagates the bad bacteria.
oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so people have these gut problems, and the doctor says, well, take, uh, I don't know, 2 pills. That's not the source of it. It is literally RF.
I didn't know that. That's
Yeah.
cool.
And it's also true that, you have this blood-brain barrier in your head, and it protects the inner mechanisms within the skull. When you have an RF signal, it diminishes the efficacy of the blood-brain barrier.
Wow.
So all of a sudden, there's more going on than ever before. And when you talk about these higher rates with 5G, um, if anyone tells you they know there's a serious problem, they're lying. Why? No science shows evidence of that yet.
Yeah,
Would I predict that to potential dangerous? Of course I would. Based on current evidence, you would say it's reasonably likely that path will continue to be impairing the human body.
sure. Yeah, we're the clinical trial.
Yeah, we are. It's literally true
Yeah.
that we are the clinical trial.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, so
So, kind of piggybacking on you mentioning about the gut being disrupted, is there anything from your research on ways, supplement, nutrition, lifestyle that we can help heal that frontal lobe? Is there any way we can reverse some of that damage?
um, correlated to that is hypoxic states that occur as a result of exposures. So you really want to hydrate as much as you can.
Okay.
You want to avoid those tight exposures. And there are some that claim that there could be supplements that can actually change that pattern and improve it. There's no scientific evidence that suggests that.
Oh,
And so if you're concerned about what you may want to be able to do, um, use earpieces. Like, see this.
right.
I have an acoustical coupling link. In other words, I don't have electricity coming up to my ear. I convert it farther down where it doesn't affect the area of my brain. And that's an action you can take to
Right.
minimize those exposures. And there are actions you can take. And um, cautionary measures is a good idea. Think about what you can do to help reduce that exposures.
Right.
There, I know this is off topic, but you've probably heard about free radicals and antioxidants,
Mhm.
which is oxidative stress, right? I don't believe any of that. There is some oxidative stress that occurs, but the human body itself, there's a natural body response. Cell danger response is what Dr. Navio calls it. And it's really impacting the vagus nerves through the skin. So there's a lot of indirect stuff going on that concentration of metals in the chest as a result of exposures has been studied in some stuff I've seen. So you want to try to avoid that by just being cautious about being exposed to this stuff.
Right. Now, have some of these frequencies like 5G have any of these been weaponized or is there any correlation with any of that?
There is.
Okay.
Actually, it turns, I actually have people I know who they jack up the RF signals at certain frequencies, very high levels, and it interferes with the brain, the normal function of the brain, and they can almost implant um, a message that drop your gun, and it's I know it's personally been used in some warfare. And so I don't know much about it, but I do know it's been in warfare. What we're talking about, it's not a gun that's going to affect us like they would want in warfare. It's used with what I told you about with the sweat gland. There's that kind of, and which, by the way, is also used in war.
Uh-huh.
And that's sort of the stuff that bothers me a little bit because we really don't know what happens in between all those things, the frequency rates. We
Right.
just don't have experience enough to know. And really, we know an awful lot, in my opinion, with a standard cell phone transmission, but we know very little in the 5G space. And 6G's up to terahertz. So what's a terahertz? It's 1 trillion cycles per second. A terahertz is into the ionized space, the X-ray space. And we have the next generation beyond 5G, 6G. It's up to 2.2 terahertz.
Oh my God.
So this trend to use technology we don't know much about seems to be accelerating.
Right.
It gives us a lot of benefits, I suppose, but I'm not sure I need those benefits so much. So
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't know if it's in our health wise our best interest, right?
yeah, there's no doubt. Let's talk a tiny bit about that. Now, there are some very well educated experts in the space, and they talk about calcium channel penetration of the cell. And that kind of exposure with these kinds of transmitters is reducing our ability to create people
Hmm.
because of the exposures, right, to the womb and to the men. And so that's likely not true statistically. So the dangers are not that all of us are going to die of cancer. That's not where, in my opinion, where this is going. It's just that you're going to wake up and you're going to have a headache. You're not thinking quite clearly. You're foggy. You're fatigued, maybe, and that is symptoms of excess exposures. And that's the stuff I'm more concerned about. And that's why I always suggest being precautionary about what you use with these technologies, so you have a better chance of dealing with these over time. And
Exactly.
remember, 20% when I started, 15, 20% when I started, it's up to 50% now. And by the way, mostly women. And no one knows why. 80% of that population is women. Some suggest hormones are the difference. Women feel it more than men.
Yeah, I could see that with the estrogen.
Yeah, right. That's what people are suggesting.
Yeah, that would make sense to me.
Yeah.
Um, little off topic, but kind of piggybacking on the health conditions. Is there any research showing that it affects gamma waves, theta waves in the brain, any of that?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, there's been some. So there is something you can do that. There are tools in the marketplace that balance brainwaves, right? I don't know. I have a bunch of friends who have this stuff. And they're correcting brain patterns that have occurred as a result of exposures to some extent. And we work with one clinic. They use this protocol to take someone who's walking, but his brain is sleeping, and vice versa. The gamma and they're getting reversed. So there's been some evidence that it really does change
Huh.
the brain pattern, and it can be to the extent where you're walking, you're actually sleeping in the brain. So
Wow. Because I've seen some um like nets. Do they have EMF nets that
yeah,
people?
the nets. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Those are the benefits of some of that. You don't want to ground yourself, by the way. Um, those are oftentimes grounded.
Yeah.
You don't really want to ground stuff. Like people talk about, I have a sheets that I use in my bed,
Mhm.
and because I'm worried about electromagnetic radiation. Well, guess what? That's you in the middle of the field again, getting um, executed because it's attracting the emissions in the room.
Got it. That
And
makes
so
sense.
you do not want to be grounded. However, a floating ground, which is just a piece of material on top of your bed, actually works pretty well because it's not attracting to ground. It's just taking the ambient in the room.
Got it.
So simple things you can do. Uh, I was talking with a fellow that considered himself the grounding expert, and he didn't know who he was talking to, right? So I said, "So you're telling me if I'm on a grounding pad that I'm always safe?" And he said, "Of course." I said, "Well, when I put a cell phone to my head, am I safe?" No, you're not safe. Of course, you're not safe, right? And he had to rethink his thinking because he was they were attracting the signals in a worse way with a cell phone. So you got to be careful um,
Sure.
with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I have so many patients ask me about the grounding sheets, the grounding mats, and
Yeah,
yeah,
and they're okay a little bit,
sure.
but well, your body's a capacitor. It,
Hmm.
it it can absorb the ambient around you. So if you walk on the beach in sand, it's a wonderful ground for
Yep.
that excess energy. That's great as a way of balancing your body. Walking on grass
Yep.
is a grounding,
Yep.
but always being on a pad, it helps a little bit in the beginning. Make sure you don't do it too much
Right. Right.
because you have excess loss of energy, which now is being compromised within the body.
That makes sense to me. Yeah. So what do so our listeners kind of have an idea. What do you personally do for prevention and to promote your health against EMFs?
I never put a phone in my head.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the story. We had we have a company that uh, started bring protection to my sons, right? So um, my wife thought they shouldn't use their laptops. I'm a mechanical engineer. So I said, okay, I'll build something, right? And so I actually built a pad for them. And that pad ended up becoming a product for a company that we have. And then I heard an article about a 6-year old child that demanded a cell phone from her parents. They got it a year later. She passed away from frontal lobe cancer. And I got very disturbed because I knew the standard that I created for my boys could be applied into cell phones
Mhm.
and it would prevent the signal from going into the brain. And so I ended up having a product for that. So to answer your question, I don't put a cell phone to my head without protection. And I don't worry about it at that point.
Good.
When I come in to my home, I put my keys on it. I have it where the router's in a far corner. I turn it off at night. They use it for a day, but it's so far away. The signal is very low. And so I have that within my house. I have it all Ethernet wired. We don't use anything that's not connected to an Ethernet connection. And so there are certain things that I do, include when I put my keys on, by the way, I put my cell phone there too.
Yep.
Yeah, I just don't put it into the house. It's
Yeah.
a simple thing to do. Sadly, I'm getting older and it's hard for me to run when it rings, but but uh, I'm okay with that. I'm safe.
Yeah.
And so there's simple things I do to try to minimize it. Uh, we haven't talked about bedroom.
Oh, yes. Yep.
Let's talk about bedroom. I consider that such an important sanctuary.
Hmm.
Um, and so on the top of my list is don't read a tablet within an hour of going to sleep. Why? Well, there's a little cryptochrome protein in the back of the eye. That is the switch that turns and says, oh, it's dark out. Okay, let's get that melatonin going. And so there are certain body functions that occur. And when you're looking at these monitors and the blue light's influencing it, the cryptochrome protein switch is not going on. And so you don't want to have that on. When you put it down an hour before you go to sleep, make sure it's in another room. You do not want any transmitters in the room. I was on a podcast once and I was talking to this bright woman, and I said, don't put a cell phone on your desk or table next to you. You're sleeping. Um, and she said, oh, thank you so much for letting me know that. About 2 weeks later, she called me up. She said, my husband and I took our cell phones out of the room and we finally slept. It does make a difference. Removing those emissions out of the room is, for some, very subtle, maybe not, but for others, a very big change. And for her, she really did feel that change. So you want it as clean as possible. Some people are so sensitive that the wiring in the wall, the extremely low frequency stuff bothers them. So I also suggest you may want to be a couple of feet away from the wall if
Sure.
you can with your bed. And that makes a big difference by neutralizing your environment. And why is all that important? Because your circadian rhythm is maintained, right? Your chondral repair occurs,
Yep.
and that's at night, right?
Yep.
That's when you recover. And
Yeah.
if you're not really sleeping, you get into a cycle that you can't recover out of. So
Yeah.
that's why you want a sanctuary as clean as possible.
Yeah. One more question. Speaking of that, what about those sound machines? Any issues with those?
I I'm aware of a couple companies that use light and sound.
Yeah.
Light is not something I would use.
Okay.
Why? Because it's a path to the brain.
Got it.
It's the very quick path to the brain. So if you're like a hypersensitive, and on the average, you half of you is, um, and so you're irritating the body simply by using that light. Sound is different. It does actually work, um, and it doesn't have the same um, impact as the lights, which would be negative. The only thing I would caution people to do is if you're using those um, programs or equipment, you really sort of want to use earbuds that are safe.
Sure.
And so we actually work with one company that does have an app that they offer, and we typically are associated with that app because we don't have the RF signal or anything up there.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure the listeners have too.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm glad.
Yep.
Well, well, I want to thank you so much, Heather, for inviting me. I do appreciate it. You're wonderful to chat with, and I think people did learn a bit about it, and hopefully we helped them make some choices in their own life on how they want to deal with this particular toxin in our life.